This is not a bipartisan thing. The resistance to gun legislation comes exclusively from the Republican Party. There is an exclusive desire to never, ever find a way to solve these problems that has anything to do with guns. On Monday, we had the shooting in Nashville. The whole episode, we're not going to litigate that anymore. There's really not much to litigate at this point until we see the manifesto, which Lord knows when we're going to eventually get to see that. But I want to talk now about, and I talked about this in the offline segment that I uploaded earlier today, actually. We need to start talking about solutions and about how we kind of how we respond to these kind of actions. Right now there is a concerted effort to make the shooting in Nashville about trans ideology, about trans identity, about Christian phobia, about school safety, right? About all of these other topics that, quite frankly, in my opinion, school safety could be one that we could have a conversation about, but the rest don't really bear out to have anything to do with the actual attack that happened. And I want to take a look at, apparently, in Kentucky, not far from Tennessee, mind you, I believe like one state over, right? Like, if I remember correct, if I remember the United States map, isn't Kentucky like right under or above Tennessee, if I remember correctly? It is. Lovely. Yeah. So just north of Tennessee, 24 hours later, Kentucky decided to pass. And keep in mind, I remember we had that caller on who said, oh, it's hard to pass laws if you live in too diverse of neighborhoods, if your society is not homogenous enough, it's hard to pass laws. I find that funny because at the end of the day, in Kentucky, part of America, a diverse country, one would presume by this assumption that they were making, it seems like they were able to pass a law here. But unfortunately, this law was to make Kentucky a sanctuary city for the Second Amendment. I'm not sure what that means, so let's kind of educate ourselves together, shall we?
Kentucky is now a Second Amendment sanctuary state after a new law took effect this morning without the governor's signature.
It comes just 24 hours after the latest mass shooting, this time at an elementary school in Nashville. Bodie Brooks joins us now in studio to break down the new law. Bodie.
Now, I want everybody to keep in mind, this law, this law is not a response to the attack in Nashville 24 hours before. It's not a response. This law was going to get passed on this day, regardless as to whether there was a shooting or not. But does it not say a lot that in the United States of America, we have a deadly mass shooting that leads to the death of 3 adults and 3 children, and just one state over, they have not decided to put any more restrictions on firearm purchasing and ownership. They have not decided to make anybody more safe. They have been working diligently to this point to make sure that people who want to own or carry firearms are allowed to obtain them regardless. They have done they have seen this happen, or I should say, this was always their goal, to be able to have more gun ownership, more guns in their state, even while one state above them, or I guess one state below them in that case, one state below them, there was this horrible massacre. So, like, keep in mind, like, this isn't a response to the event, but certainly it says something to where our priorities as a nation are.
Yeah, Monty, Marvin, the law requires local and state police officers to not enforce any future gun regulations that come from the federal level. Now, this kind of shooting typically brings a debate on gun control.
I got into this movement because I wanted my grandchildren to live in
I'll
a
get that
safer
in a second. Let's get
world
through a
than
little bit
my
of this.
daughters
This is only 3
did
minutes
when
long,
they were
but I will
growing up.
answer that.
And yet we're not in that place right now.
Kathy Mekas is one of many Kentuckians pushing for laws to prevent gun violence, like safe storage and expanded background checks. She believes making Kentucky a Second Amendment sanctuary state is a step backwards in safety.
If the federal government passes a ban, we're not going to use our taxpayer dollars to help them enforce that.
That, at its root, is House Bill 153. Now Kentucky...
So I do really love that sentiment where it's... The idea is, hey, you passed a law, the federal government passed a law, we in this state disagree with it, we're just not going to participate. We are simply not going to even bother, enforcing that law that the federal government hands down. Which is, I should say, isn't really, it's the case that we kind of see that kind of broadly, right? I believe in Colorado, there really is an enforcement of marijuana policies that there are federally, because in the state of Colorado, marijuana has been legalized. Now, here's the difference in how I see those two things. The difference is that marijuana has not been shown to have deadly outcomes to people. Firearms, on the other hand, has. And certainly there is no, we already have a Second Amendment right. That's already something that's federally guaranteed, let alone guaranteed in each state's constitution. But certainly, there's no real need for any of this. In no way is this Kentucky legislature, do they need to validate more of a Second Amendment? You already have all of your Second Amendment rights right there in the federal, in the federal constitution of your rights, right? But they're going out of their way to kind of reinforce and bolster these, because a bit of this is a virtue signal. A bit of it is, because certainly it's not a safety measure. I'll go look it up while we watch this, because I'm kind of curious now that I think about it. But the question always becomes: are we a more or less safe society with more guns? And we know this answer. Go back far enough in history before we had stricter gun restrictions. In some states, there were more firearm deaths. There were more assaults with firearms. This is, at the end of the day, a armed society isn't a polite society. It's a fearful society. And I don't know if you know anything about fear, but fear doesn't create politeness. It creates anxiety, and usually creates fear and aggression in people. So keep that in mind also.
Law without the endorsement of the governor. As Fox 56 political analyst Jonathan Miller puts it, it's the ultimate messaging law that Kentucky is a pro-gun state, but its effects may not go far.
Remember that this only prevents state and local law enforcement officials from enforcing these federal laws. It doesn't prevent the ATW or federal agents from enforcing them. So the impact of this would be limited. And that's if it's constitutional.
Miller says the new law could come to the courtroom to work out the debate over whether federal law is supreme to state law and how it's enforced. A similar law was ruled unconstitutional in Missouri. The Nashville shooting could fuel that.
Yeah, and it's kind of obvious. The states can't pass laws that undermine or conflict with federal laws. At the end of the day, the federal government is there to take supremacy over the entire country. Like, the idea that it would be, oh, well, my state law says this, like, no, like, my state law says that I can murder somebody as long as it's on a Wednesday and and it's between the hours of 5 and 6 a.m. Like, no, that's not how that works. Like, that it's not at all how that works. Like, we can't have states going past their own versions of whatever nonsense societal organization that they want. Like, that'd be ridiculous.
First lawsuit.
Law enforcement has come out and said it's dangerous for them. It puts their lives at risk because
which they're not wrong. Also, that's also the thing. Keep in mind, like, most law enforcement does not agree with the kind of lax gun laws that we see in a lot of states. Certainly there are absolutely police, considering police generally are more Republican leaning than they are Democrat leaning. But talk to any gun owner, talk to any cop, and they'll tell you that more guns on the street is not safe for them personally. For them, it makes things more dangerous, a more armed. It's why whenever there's any of these mass shooting events, right? It's dangerous to have people, lone people, trying to respond to gunfire from like, you know, some crazy mass shooter. It's harder for police to distinguish who the mass shooter is and who the defending person is. It's very difficult. You're working with a lot of minimal information. So, you know, there's been times where people who have stopped mass shooters have then gotten shot themselves by cops or been attacked by cops because the cops don't know. They just know 2 people in this building. There's shots fired. We don't know who fired first. This, that, and the other. And when you're doing even routine stops, cops have to think, oh, you know, if we're living in a very you know, gun permissive state, then I run the risk when I pull someone over. I run the higher risk of being shot, of being attacked by the person I'm pulling over. There's whenever the more lax the laws, the more dangerous a police officer's job becomes.
Federal agencies.
But to be clear, this bill does not stop all federal gun regulations, just ones made by the Biden administration and beyond.
This federal ban becomes effective January 1, 2021. Any previous federal laws regarding firearms will be upheld in the state of Kentucky. Right now, we have a president in the Oval Office who is executive order happy.
The new law also calls for local police officers to be charged if they enforce future federal gun laws. Lawmakers can also...
Oh, that's fucking insane. Yeah. So that's also kind of the insane part, that you could run that back really quickly.
Charged if they enforce future federal gun laws. Lawmakers can also come back to amend the law should the
idea that you would charge a police officer for enforcing a federal law in your state, even if that federal law passes after this legislation, right? Like you know, any future you know, restrictions that the federal government puts on gun ownership or any of that stuff, right? The idea that you would set this precedent already for that is actually insane. It's actually insane. The idea that you would arrest police officers for enforcing the laws is psychotic. You know, and again, will this actually be something that's like invoked often? I don't really think so. But certainly, you know, certainly there are going to be a few situations, and the goal of passing this legislation at the end of the day isn't really to lock up cops who enforce the law. It's to send a signal to you know, to, I mean, let's be honest here, gun manufacturers and their lobbyists, that Kentucky politicians are good investments in terms of lobbying money. That's number one. Number two is it's a virtue signal to you know, Second Amendment absolutists. It's a signal to those people to gain votes. At the end of the day, when you're a politician, you want to get votes. A good way to do that is the virtue signal. It's something that won't really affect your society very much, won't really do very much, but will send a message to people in that society that you agree with them. Or, you know, that you share their goals, their perspectives, their biases, all the rest of that stuff. But anyway, right. Right. Okay, so explain what piece of gun legislation specifically would have stopped the shooting. Well, okay. So Gaines, here's the problem with your initial volley here. There isn't one piece of legislation that's going to specifically stop any individual shooting. There isn't that there isn't a, would you like to know the thing that we could do, the piece of legislation that we could pass to specifically have stopped the shooting in Nashville would be for us to set aside money to build a time machine so that we could send police back in time before the shooting occurred and arrest the shooter. That's the only real thing that we could have done specifically to address that shooting. Like your framing on this is all wrong. You're trying to have like you're taking broad legislation and trying to say like, oh, would it stop this one specific case? That's not what we pass legislation for. It's not what we pass laws for. We pass laws to form society and to form a structure around how we interact with each other and how the law interacts with us. Now, the specific laws that I think could be useful, and these are, I don't know that any of these or a combination of these would have stopped the specific Nashville shooting, because there are always going to be holes when you are accounting for people's freedoms. At the end of the day, I can't just say, if you want the actual thing that would have stopped it, besides my being a bit glib and saying time travel, it's just a ban on guns. We just have the police, have the military show up at every single person's house, shut down every single gun shop, take everybody's guns, throw them in a smelter, and call it a day. That's the actual thing, but that's not realistic, and certainly I don't think that's in line with our freedoms. But if we want to talk about legislation that could reduce the likelihood of these events happening, and, you know, in some instances catch some of these before they happen, they are as such: universal background checks, which let me go see if I can look it up, because I've said this before and I know the numbers changed. An overwhelming majority of Americans questioned in a poll conducted one day after the mass shooting in an elementary school in Texas. This is Uvalde. Survey console Politico show. Oh, can I like actually look at the thing? Can I just look directly at it? Let's see. Now, generally speaking, would you say that things in the country? No. That's not what I want. Approve or disapprove Joe Biden. I want the gun law ones. Below list of possible. Vital invest. Critical. Can I control F on this page? Will that work? Gun. Oh, Christ above, there's more. Okay, I'm not reading this entire thing. Fair enough, we'll read the article. Showed that 73% of respondents strongly support universal background checks, and 15% somewhat support the requirement. Only 4% said they somewhat oppose background checks, and another 4% strongly opposed them. 5% said they had no opinion. Now, rather broad support with the American populace. I couldn't find specific gun owner numbers, but I have heard that those are also rather high, because background checks are pretty, especially nowadays, rather hardly an inconvenience. For the most part, you fill out a few lines on a form. If I remember correctly, when I bought the Canic that I bought a couple years ago, that probably took about, honest to God, maybe 90 seconds for my background check to come back. Pretty much, you know, most gun stores will have you either fill out a like piece of paper, like a paperwork, or there's usually forms online that you can do. You literally fill it out. By the time I walked back to the counter to talk to the to the dealer, my background check was already done. It was done before I even got back to the table on the other side of the room. So when we say universal background checks are not only popular but pretty standard and uncontroversial laws that we could be reinforcing, that would be one of them. The second one is something that's more of like I don't know how broad this idea is, but I think we should absolutely be requiring dual registration, which is to say registration in both the states and federally. Obviously, some states don't have registration laws. Here in Colorado, there are no registration laws. You can go buy a firearm and that's it. You could go buy it with a card. You can buy it with cash. There's no paper trail for that specific firearm. I don't think that is a workable system in 2023. Too often do we see shooters go to either gun stores or they go to gun shows to get deals, because gun shows generally have a little bit better deals. And they end up purchasing firearms for, you know, that we can't really track. I think that's something that we should be able to do. The same way that we track people's vehicles. If you've ever had to register your vehicle with the state, you can't just sell it to somebody and that's it. There needs to be registration paperwork. The state has to know about it. The actual, there's paperwork that has to be filed in the transfer of that vehicle to you. I just want something like that for, at the very least, on a federal level, If there are going to be states that decide that they don't want to participate in that, that's fine. In that case, then we'll let the federal government run registration. And, states that also offer that, that would be good to have both of those entities have the information on that firearm. It also would cut down, I think, on, there was a whole thing about ghost guns a couple years ago, over, I believe they're called P80s. P80s where you build them all yourself. You can buy all of the individual components. That was a whole ordeal. And even those should absolutely probably be illegal, simply because there's no serial number. As far as anybody knows, they don't exist. And we need to be able to track how many firearms are in the country. And I think it's fair to say we should be able to track and know where all of them are. After that, the other one is red flag laws. Each state has kind of a combo of red flag laws that they've passed, things that they think are reasonable and don't take people's rights away, but certainly can stem the the use of firearms to harm people or for people to harm themselves. These are, again, I think let me see how many states have them. I believe they're pretty let's see, red, count with me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. There are 20 right now that are already in effect. Quite a lot are proposed throughout the country, and a few that it doesn't seem non-applicable. I'm going to assume that means that there aren't any proposed. So red flag laws rather distributed rather broadly across the nation. Again, I don't think they take people's rights away. These are safety measures, obviously. You're not going to get your stuff confiscated for life, but if there is a credible threat to yours or others' lives, I do think that the cops have a absolute imperative, a right to come in and confiscate those for a bit. I think that's perfectly fair. A lot of times we also hear with a lot of these shooters that somebody called in the day before, 2 days before or so, mentioning that, hey, this person was acting a bit sussy, maybe you guys should go take a look. And if there aren't proper red flag laws on the books in those states, or if precincts aren't willing to exercise them, which some police precincts actually have said they won't do, then these shootings happens. They could have easily been prevented since they were kind of tipped off about the about this any possible shooting. So same with this would also help with if you're aware of somebody who's going through a spell of mental depression, if you believe they might be suicidal and you know that they own firearms, that also might be a good way to stem the use of firearm assisted suicide, which is the most effective and I believe the actual highest rate of like suicide, or how people end up committing suicide. So there's also that aspect to it that I think could be helpful. The other one, where was it? Okay, this is another one that same with the registration bit. I don't know how widespread this is, but cartridge and caliber restrictions. I do think we should be restricting private citizens down to about 45 ACP and lower. I have never seen a use argument for the storage of anything above 45 ACP. It's just never really been something I've heard a good argument for. I don't see, a lot of people go out for hunting, and I think that you should be able to get a permit to purchase higher grade ammunition for hunting. But otherwise, pistol caliber is about as much as I think any American should be able to get their hands on. I leave space for 45 ACP specifically because there are going to be people who want to shoot 1911s, and I understand that. And to a degree, I can live with that. I can live with 45 ACP and lower. But 10 millimeter, you're going up to 5.56, 7.62. Anything above that, I think is not really arguable in terms of private storage, private use. I'm not dedicated to that one, but I do think there is an argument to maybe we don't need to have all of the higher grades of ammunition kind of milling about all over the country. If it's not out there, it can't be stolen. So, if you're a gun store, if you're a business, different story. But a private citizen, I don't think, needs those sorts of that kind of caliber or cartridge. Last one, storage requirements. There just kind of should be storage requirements. I have no problem with the police coming in and checking up on people once a year, once every 2 years, maybe even 3 to 5 years or so. Coming in once to verify that you're abiding by a certain set of storage requirements. I don't know what those specific ones would be. I don't really have a outline of that, but just some form of formalized, this is how your guns need to be kept. You are not allowed to just leave them in your drawer unsecured, all the rest of this stuff. You can't just put them in like your side bed with like some flimsy ass lock. No, you need to go buy a case, you need to buy locks, you need to have them, and we're not going to tell you when we show up. So if you're full of shit and you're not actually abiding by the safety storage requirements, then your shit's going to get confiscated for a bit. But I think Japan does this a lot. It's a real bitch to own firearms in Japan, because they have very strict storage requirements. And I think we should adopt at least a minimal amount of those. Most gun owners, also keep in mind, this wouldn't be much of an inconvenience. Most gun owners have safes, have cases with a lot of locks, build out entire infrastructure into their house to store their firearms. This isn't going to be inconvenient for most gun owners. This is going to be inconvenient for irresponsible gun owners, which are the people that I want to target. I want to target irresponsible gun owners who let their guns get in the hands of their kids, who then accidentally shoot somebody, shoot themselves, or go on rampages. Yeah, either way, those are my 5 things that I want. Again, none of them are specifically going to address this or that shooting, because shootings happen within the margins and within the little spaces that people end up getting these firearms with. But we need to have some kind of response, some way to shore up the ship, basically. We can't simply throw our hands up and say, well, there's always going to be mass shootings, so we shouldn't ever pass laws to prevent that from happening. We need to respond some way substantively to stem the frequency of these things happening. I don't think any of this will stop any of it. It's not like we pass these tomorrow, all the things I want, and we will never see a mass shooting again. It's not what I'm saying. I just want a reduction in it, because we have a disproportionate amount of mass shootings in this country compared to others. But speaking of legislation, that actually segues very nicely into the next video I want to watch, which is kind of indicative of the frustration I feel, because it is a cowardice that we see from lawmakers to simply not do anything. They seem to be at this avenue, this fork in the road of do nothing, do literally anything, and they consistently take the to do nothing road. And I want to take a look at this Tennessee congressman who, again, this recent shooting happened in his state, and this is his answer to how they figured this problem out.
Any sense, based on your reporting, based on your conversations, that given the nature of this tragedy, given that we are talking about 9-year-olds who lost their lives in yet another mass shooting, is there any sense that this time is different, Ryan?
In many ways, Kristen, it feels like a rinse and repeat situation here. I've been on Capitol Hill after many of these mass shootings, very similar to this one in Nashville, and we generally get the same response from lawmakers from both sides of the Hill. And one of those lawmakers I caught up with is Congressman Tim Burchett, who represents Knoxville, that's Tennessee, a little ways away from
coward.
Nashville, but in the same state. And I think he really crystallized, the Republican view of whether or not gun control legislation is worth it. Take a listen.
And I want to keep in mind, this is not a bipartisan thing. The resistance to gun legislation comes exclusively from the Republican Party. There is an exclusive desire to never, ever find a way to solve these problems that has anything to do with guns. It just isn't. It's not something they're willing to touch. It's not something they're willing to be involved in. And the reason I say that again, and I want to hammer this down. The reason why this guy is going to come on here after a massacre happened in his state and say that there's nothing that they can do is for one reason and one reason only. It's not because he cares about rights. It's not because he cares about the Second Amendment. It's because this guy takes money from the NRA, who is funneled money by gun manufacturers. Gun manufacturers fund the NRA, who turns around and funds politicians, specifically in the Republican Party, so that they never touch gun legislation. Any reasonable person would be open to debate, would be open to a conversation about how we respond to these mass shooting events, but they're not. There isn't a single Republican who's willing to even have a conversation on gun control because they're paid not to. They're paid to come up with ideas about doors. They're paid to come up with ideas about alarm systems. They're paid to come up with ideas like putting fucking sniper nests in schools. They're paid to come up with every single idea that would cost more, that would be less effective, that would be, at the end of the day, not effective in stemming the profits of gun manufacturers. That is their job. Their job is to defend the profits of gun manufacturers. That's it. And they will come up with any excuse that they can to not pass gun control laws.
Legislate evil, it's just not going to happen. We've got evil in this country, and everybody is
and yet we have murder charges, and yet you can be arrested for murder charges.
And nothing happens.
The idea that we can't legislate evil out of our society is insane. Obviously, you can't to an absolute point. But goddamn, can you fucking try? And can you set the boundaries for what is acceptable behavior?
Going to fix this problem. They are the problem.
It doesn't concern you that other countries don't have this level of gun violence?
Other countries don't have our freedom either.
So you
could it possibly be? And it's funny, he actually kind of gives the game up there because that's a dumb fuck excuse. Well, we got freedoms, you see. Those other countries don't have freedoms. You know what freedom we don't have? You know what freedom our kids don't have that they have in Europe? Not being fucking shot at your local grocery store, at your local office, at your local school. These aren't things. These aren't freedoms that we have in the United States. In the United States and America, we do not have the freedom to not be shot in public by goddamn psychopaths. We don't have that freedom. Europeans have that freedom, but it's not the freedom that they want to defend. They want to defend the right for the person who shot you to get that firearm. That's whose rights they're defending.
Kind of see what the congressman told me there in response to my question about the disparity between gun violence here in the United States versus countries around the world. And he argued it was a freedom issue, which to a certain extent describes a level of tolerance with this type of violence when it comes.
This guy has no fucking problem with kids getting killed.
And, you know, this is something, again, it's something we deal with over and over again, and there just seems to be a resistance to move forward at all. There was that bipartisan gun legislation that was passed in the last Congress. But I want to point you to kind of a moment here on camera.
And keep in mind, the gun legislation that they passed, in the last session was fucking dog shit. Didn't do fucking anything. Mainly because it's written by dumbass liberals who don't know anything about guns, and it's just they try it's the thing that they can try the least on. It'll have the least amount of impact, and nothing will change. They can continue to campaign on more reforms that they're not going to go through for, because they'll pick the weak sauce ones. They'll pick the ones that aren't all that relevant.
Capitol Hill today, Kristen, that kind of crystallizes just how frustrated some are with the lack of progress in this space. And that was the Senate chaplain, Barry Black, who rarely finds the opportunity to inject politics into his morning prayer, the first prayer that is said as the Senate.
Okay, I don't care about prayer. But the thing that they tell, like at the end of all YouTube videos where they tell you to like click on one of these like things to watch more videos. Yeah, I've been meaning to film one of those. So that's what I was doing. I was just setting it up to film one.